My hands are shaking. At 72 years old, after building an empire worth hundreds of millions, after staring down corporate boards and hostile takeovers, my hands are shaking like a child's as I grip these iron bars. Catherine's home for children looks smaller than I remember. The red brick facade is crumbling now. Patches of ivy creeping up the walls like fingers trying to pull the building back into the earth. The windows are grimy, some boarded up entirely. What was once a grand Victorian mansion turned orphanage now stands as a monument to decay and neglect. But I can still see it as it was 60 years ago, imposing, fortress-like, a place where hope went to die. I should feel powerful standing here in my tailored Armani suit, my silver hair pulled back, in the same severe bun I've worn to every board meeting for the past 3 decades. My driver, James, waits patiently by the Bentley, probably wondering why his usually composed employer has been sitting in the car for 20 minutes, staring at this decrepit building like it holds the secrets of the universe. In a way, it does. Signed by the gate is new cheap plastic letters spelling out, St. Catherine's Children's Home, in a font that screams bureaucratic indifference. But the gate itself is the same wrought iron monstrosity I remember, with its sharp spear-like points designed more to keep children in than strangers out. How many times did I press my face against these bars, watching the world outside, wondering if anyone would ever come for me? No one ever did. I take a deep breath, tasting the familiar mix of car exhaust and something else, something that still makes my stomach clench with phantom hunger. Even after all these years, even after I've eaten in the finest restaurants across 5 continents, my body remembers what it felt like to be slowly starved within these walls. Mrs. Chun? James's voice cuts through the October air. Shall I wait here? Or would you prefer I return later? I don't answer immediately. Instead, I push open the gate, noting how it still creaks with that same rusty groan that used to make my 12-year-old heart race with terror. Every sound in this place meant something: footsteps in the hallway, the slam of a door, the jingle of keys. We learn to interpret them all, to know when to hide, when to disappear into the shadows. Wait here, James, this won't take long. That's a lie. I've been planning this moment for 60 years, and I intend to savor every second of it. The path to the front door is cracked concrete, weeds pushing through like small acts of rebellion. I remember this walk, how it felt endless when I first arrived, clutching my pathetic little suitcase and that photograph of my parents. I was so naive then, thinking this place would be a temporary home, that someone would come for me. That kindness was a given, rather than a privilege. Mrs. Whitmore cured me of that delusion quickly enough. As I approach the heavy oak doors, I can feel the weight of the documents in my briefcase: legal papers, bank transfers, evidence that's been decades in the making. Today, I become the owner of St. Catherine's Home for Children. Today, I fire every single person who works here. Today, I finally keep the promise I made to myself when I was 16, and walking out of this hell with nothing but rage and determination. The brass nameplate next to the door reads Director Patricia Garrett. Miss Garrett, as we used to call her. Mrs. Whitmore's eager assistant, who stood by and watched as children were systematically broken down, who participated in the cruelty with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found her calling. She's about to learn what it feels like to be powerless. I press the doorbell, and the sound echoes through the building, the same chime I heard on my first day here, when I still believed in the possibility of rescue. The irony isn't lost on me. I am my own rescue now. 60 years too late for the girl I was, but not too late for the children who were still trapped inside. Footsteps approach from the other side of the door. My heart is pounding so hard. I'm sure whoever opens it will hear it. But my hands have stopped shaking now. The trembling fear of that hungry, desperate child has crystallized into something else entirely cold. Calculated purpose. The door opens and I see her face. Patricia Garrett, aged and weathered, but still carrying herself with that same air of petty authority that once terrified me. She doesn't recognize me, of course. Why would she? The Margaret Chun who stands before her bears little resemblance to the malnourished, broken girl who used to cower in the basement. Yes, can I help you? I smile, and I know it's not a kind expression. It's the smile of someone who's spent decades planning this exact moment, who's built an empire brick by brick with the singular purpose of returning to this place, with enough power to burn it all down. Hello, Miss Garrett. My name is Margaret Chun. I believe we have quite a bit to discuss. I need to tell you about the day I first walked through those doors. I was 12 years old, and I thought I knew what loss felt like. I was wrong. The social worker, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes and coffee stains on her blouse, had tried to prepare me during the car ride. St. Catherine's is a good place, Margaret, she'd said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. They'll take care of you until we can find you a permanent home. She spoke in that gentle tone adults use when they're lying to children, thinking kindness can soften the blow of abandonment. I clutched my suitcase, a battered brown thing that had belonged to my father, and the photograph of my parents that I'd salvaged from our apartment after the fire. In the picture, my mother was laughing, her hand resting on my father's shoulder, as they stood in front of the small restaurant where they'd worked 18-hour days, trying to build something better for me. They'd been in America for only 5 years, but they'd already started dreaming in English. The fire took everything. Their dreams, their lives, their daughter's future. All that remained was me and this photograph. And now even that felt fragile. In my trembling hands. Catherine's looked impressive from the outside. The Victorian mansion rose 3 stories high, with ornate stonework and tall windows that caught the late afternoon sun. There was a garden out front, well maintained, with roses that bloomed in neat rows. It looked like the kind of place where wealthy families once lived, where children played in sprawling rooms and ran up grand staircases. I should have known better. Beauty, I would learn, was often just another kind of lie. The social worker walked me to the front door, her heels clicking on the stone steps. She knocked, and after a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the door opened to reveal a woman who would haunt my dreams for decades to come. Mrs. Whitmore was tall and angular, with steel-grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch. Her pale skin, her dark dress was impeccable, not a wrinkle or stain in sight, and she wore it like armor. But it was her eyes that made my stomach drop cold. Calculating. The kind of eyes that saw children as problems to be managed, rather than people to be cared for. Margaret Chun. Her voice was crisp, efficient. She looked me up and down like she was inspecting a piece of furniture for defects. I'm Mrs. Whitmore, the director of St. Catherine's. We've been expecting you. The social worker squeezed my shoulder. I'll check on you soon, dear, she whispered, though we both knew she wouldn't. There were too many children, too many fires to put out, too many tragedies like mine happening every day. I watched her walk away, her figure getting smaller and smaller, until she disappeared around the corner. That's when it hit me I was truly alone now. No parents, no relatives who wanted me. No one who would notice if I simply vanished. Well, don't just stand there, Mrs. Whitmore said, stepping aside to let me enter. Come in. The inside of St. Catherine's was nothing like the outside. The grand foyer had been stripped of any warmth or comfort. The floors were polished to a cold shine, and the walls were painted an institutional green that seemed designed to drain the life from everything it touched. Children's voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, not the joyful sounds of play, but the muted, careful noises of people who'd learned to be invisible. "Miss Garrett." Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the air like a blade. A younger woman appeared almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting just around the corner. Where Mrs. Whitmore was cold efficiency, Miss Garrett was eager cruelty. She had the look of someone who'd found her calling in a place where she could exercise power over those who couldn't fight back. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore." Miss Garrett's smile was too wide, too bright. It reminded me of the way my mother used to smile when she was trying to convince me that everything would be fine, even when I could see the worry in her eyes. "This is Margaret Chen. Process her, please." Process. Like I was a piece of mail or a factory component. I hugged my suitcase tighter, feeling the corner of the photograph press against my chest. Through the fabric of my coat. Miss Garrett approached me with that same unsettling smile. "Let's get you settled, dear. First, we need to go through your belongings. Rules, you understand." She led me to a small room off the main hallway, bare except for a desk and 2 chairs. "Everything on the desk, please," she said, though her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. I hesitated. The suitcase contained everything I had left: a few clothes, a book my father had given me, and the photograph. "Can I keep the picture of my parents?" Miss Garrett's smile faltered for just a moment. "Personal items can be distracting. We find that children adjust better when they focus on their new life here, rather than dwelling on the past. But it's all I have left of them. And now you have us." Mrs. Whitmore's voice came from the doorway. She'd been watching, I realized, studying my reaction. "We are your family now, Margaret. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." I wanted to argue, to fight, to run. But I was 12 years old and completely powerless. So I opened my suitcase and watched as Miss Garrett sorted through my pathetic few possessions, setting aside my father's book and, worst of all, the photograph of my parents. "These will be kept safe," she said, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. "You can earn them back through good behavior." Earn them back. As if my parents' memory was a privilege to be granted or withheld based on my compliance. That night, lying in a narrow bed in a room with 5 other girls, I stared at the ceiling and made my first promise to myself. Someday I would be powerful, enough that no one could ever take anything from me again. I had no idea how much they would take before I got that chance. It took me 3 weeks to understand that St. Catherine's wasn't just a place where unwanted children were housed. It was a carefully constructed machine designed to break us down and rebuild us as whatever Mrs. Whitmore wanted us to be. The Bay hierarchy was invisible at first, like a secret language I hadn't learned yet. But children are quick to read the currents of power, especially when their survival depends on it. I watched, I listened, and slowly the pattern emerged. At the top were the golden children, the ones who'd learned to smile on command, who never questioned, who performed gratitude like a theatrical role. Sarah Henderson was one of them. A blonde girl about my age who'd been at St. Catherine's for 3 years. She had the best bed by the window, extra blankets, and shoes that actually fit. Most importantly, she got full meals at every sitting. "The secret," she whispered to me one night, "is to make them think you're grateful, even when you're not, especially when you're not." Below the golden children were the invisible ones, kids who'd learned to blend into the background, to never draw attention to themselves. They got standard portions, standard treatment, standard neglect. They were the majority. The ones who'd figured out that invisibility was a form of protection. And then there were the marked ones, the troublemakers, the questioners, the ones who still had fight left in them. They were the ones Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Garrett focused on with special attention. The kind of attention that came with smaller portions. extra chores, and nights spent in the basement reflection room. I became a marked 1 on my 4th day. It started in the dining hall during breakfast. We sat at long wooden tables, our backs straight, our hands folded, waiting for permission to eat. The ritual was always the same. Mrs. Whitmore would inspect our appearance, comment on our posture, remind us how fortunate we were to be fed at all. Some children in the world go to bed hungry every night, she would say, walking between the tables like a general reviewing troops. You should be grateful for every crumb. The irony of those words would haunt me later. That morning, I noticed that Tommy Morrison, a thin boy with dark circles under his eyes, was staring at his plate. With an expression I recognized, the look of someone who hadn't eaten enough in too long. His portion was noticeably smaller than the others. Just a slice of bread and a thin bowl of watery oatmeal. Why does Tommy get less food? I asked Sarah quietly. She glanced around nervously. He's been marked. Last week he asked for seconds. Asked for seconds? Mrs. Whitmore said it showed ingratitude. That if he was truly thankful, 1 portion would be enough. I looked at Tommy again. He was maybe 10 years old, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. The idea that wanting enough food to fill your stomach was a sign of ingratitude seemed insane to me. So I did something stupid. I raised my hand. Yes, Margaret. Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the morning air. I was wondering, why are some portions smaller than others? The dining hall went dead silent. Even the staff members who'd been moving around the room froze. Sarah grabbed my arm under the table, her fingers digging into my skin. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was like winter frost. I beg your pardon? Some children have less food than others. I was just wondering why. She walked over to my table, her heels clicking against the floor with each deliberate step. When she reached me, she placed her hand on my shoulder, not gently, but with the kind of grip that made it clear I wasn't going anywhere. Margaret, dear, are you questioning the way we manage our household? I was just... because it sounds very much like you're questioning my judgment. And questioning authority, as I'm sure you know, is a sign of ingratitude. The word hung in the air like a curse. I looked around the room and saw the other children staring at their plates. Nobody willing to meet my eyes. Even Sarah had scooted away from me slightly. I didn't mean... Of course you didn't, Mrs. Whitmore said, but her grip on my shoulder tightened. You're new here, so you don't understand our ways yet. But you will learn. Miss Garrett? Miss Garrett appeared at my other side like a shadow. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Please note that Margaret will be receiving the learning portion for the rest of the week. Perhaps a smaller serving will help her appreciate what she has. And just like that, I joined the ranks of the marked ones. The learning portion, I discovered, was exactly half of what the other children received. Half a slice of bread, half a bowl of oatmeal, half a piece of fruit. It was calculated starvation, designed to teach us that our basic needs were privileges to be earned through complete submission. But it wasn't just about the food. Over the following days, I learned about the other punishments reserved for the marked ones. Extra chores that kept us busy during the few recreation hours. Beds moved away from the windows to the coldest parts of the dormitory. Books and toys removed from our reach. And always the constant reminder that we had brought this on ourselves through our own failings. You could make this stop, Miss Garrett told me on the 3rd day, as I scrubbed the dining hall floor with a brush that was more worn than useful. All you have to do is apologize. Admit you were wrong to question Mrs. Whitmore. Show proper gratitude. I looked up at her, my knees aching from kneeling on the hard floor, my stomach cramping from hunger. For a moment I almost did it, almost gave in. It would have been so easy to just say the words, to bow my head and accept their version of reality. But then I thought about my parents, about how they'd worked 18-hour days and never complained, never gave up, never stopped believing that things could be better. They taught me that dignity wasn't something you could take from someone. It was something you had to give away. I wasn't wrong, I said quietly. Children shouldn't go hungry. Miss Garrett's face darkened. We'll see how long that attitude lasts. She was right to be confident. The system at St. Catherine's had been perfected over years, maybe decades. It was designed to break down resistance through a combination of physical discomfort, social isolation, and psychological manipulation. Most children lasted a few weeks before they cracked. I lasted a month. But by then, it was too late. I'd already been marked not just as a troublemaker, but as someone who needed to be made an example of. Someone who required special attention. Mrs. Whitmore had decided I needed to learn a lesson that would stick, and she knew exactly how to teach it. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. I know because Tuesdays were laundry days, and I was folding sheets in the basement when Miss Garrett came looking for me. Her face twisted with something that looked almost like excitement. "Margaret," she said, waving an envelope in the air. "You have mail." My heart stopped. In the 6 weeks I'd been at St. Catherine's, I'd never received so much as a postcard. I'd started to believe that I truly was alone in the world, that my parents had died without leaving any trace of connection behind. The envelope was addressed to me, in handwriting I didn't recognize, but the return address made my hands shake. Uncle Chem, Detroit, Michigan. My father's brother, the one who'd moved to America 5 years before my parents, who'd promised to send for us once he got established. I'd thought he'd forgotten about us, but here was proof that someone, somewhere, still cared that I existed. "Can I read it?" I asked, reaching for the envelope. Miss Garrett pulled it back, just out of my reach. "Mrs. Whitmore needs to review all correspondence first." Policy. I waited 3 days. 3 days of wondering what my uncle had written, of imagining that maybe he was coming for me, that maybe this nightmare was finally ending. When Mrs. Whitmore finally summoned me to her office, I practically ran down the hallway. She was sitting behind her massive wooden desk, the letter opened in front of her. But her expression wasn't the neutral bureaucratic mask I'd expected. She looked angry. "Sit down, Margaret." I sat, my eyes fixed on the letter. I could see Chinese characters mixed with English words. My uncle's attempt to bridge the languages. My parents had taught me to navigate. "This letter," Mrs. Whitmore said, tapping it with her finger, "is very concerning." "What does it say?" "Your uncle claims he's been writing to you for weeks. He says he's been trying to arrange for you to come live with him in Detroit." She paused, studying my face. "He seems to think we've been keeping his letters from you." My stomach dropped. "Have you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, and I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I'd questioned her again, accused her of lying, and this time there were no other children around to witness what came next. "Margaret," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "are you suggesting that I would deliberately keep a child from her family?" "No, because that's exactly what you're suggesting. You're saying that I'm a liar and a kidnapper." She stood up, moving around the desk to loom over me. "Is that what you think of me?" "I didn't mean. You know what I think." She interrupted. "I think you've been here for 6 weeks and you still haven't learned the most basic lesson of gratitude. You still think you're entitled to question authority, to make demands, to act like the world owes you something." She walked to the window, her back to me. "Your uncle may think he wants you, but he doesn't know what we know. He doesn't know that you're defiant, ungrateful, and disruptive. He doesn't know that you've been marked as a problem child." "But I'm not." Silence. The word cracked like a whip. "You've just proven my point. Even now, even when you're in trouble, you can't stop arguing." She turned back to me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood freeze. It was satisfaction, like she'd been waiting for this moment. I think it's time for you to learn what real discipline looks like. Miss Garrett. Miss Garrett appeared so quickly she must have been listening outside the door. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Margaret needs to be moved to the reflection room. Indefinitely. The reflection room. I'd heard whispers about it, a small basement room where the worst offenders were sent. But I'd never heard of anyone being sent there indefinitely. For how long? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Until you learn proper respect, Mrs. Whitmore said. Until you understand that your place here is to be grateful for what you're given, not to question what you're not. Miss Garrett grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. Come along, dear. The reflection room was exactly as terrible as I'd imagined. It was barely larger than a closet, with concrete walls and a single small window near the ceiling that let in just enough light to see how hopeless the situation was. There was a narrow cot with a thin blanket, a bucket in the corner, and nothing else. Your meals will be brought to you, Miss Garrett explained, though her smile suggested they wouldn't be much. You'll stay here until Mrs. Whitmore decides you've learned your lesson. She started to leave, then turned back. Oh, and Margaret? The other children have been told not to interact with you. Anyone caught speaking to you or sharing food will join you down here. The door closed with a final click, and I heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. The first day, they brought me a piece of bread and a cup of water. The second day, the same. By the third day, I realized this wasn't just punishment. It was systematic starvation designed to break my will. But it was the letter that hurt most. My uncle had been trying to reach me, had been fighting for me, and I'd never known. How many letters had there been? How many times had he written, wondering why I never responded? By now, he probably thought I didn't want to see him, that I was happy in this place. As the days turned into weeks, as my clothes grew looser and my stomach learned to stop growling, I began to understand the true genius of Mrs. Whitmore's cruelty. She wasn't just punishing me, she was erasing me, making me disappear from the world one meal at a time. But even as my body grew weaker, something else grew stronger. The anger I felt wasn't the hot, impulsive rage of a child. It was something colder, more patient. It was the kind of anger that could wait decades for the right moment to strike back. I might be trapped in this basement, slowly starving, but I was learning lessons that Mrs. Whitmore never intended to teach. I was learning that power wasn't just about authority. It was about information, about patience, about remembering every detail of how cruelty worked so you could one day turn it back on those who wielded it. They thought they were breaking me. They had no idea they were forging me into something much more dangerous than a defiant child. They were creating their own reckoning dot by the third week in that basement room. I had learned to measure time not by the fading light from the tiny window, but by the hollow ache in my stomach that had become my constant companion. The single piece of bread and cup of water they brought me each day wasn't sustenance. It was a reminder of my powerlessness, calculated to keep me alive, but too weak to fight back. But hunger, I discovered, could sharpen the mind as much as it weakened the body. The room had been designed to break children, but whoever had built it hadn't considered that a desperate child could find opportunity in the smallest oversight. The tiny window near the ceiling, meant to provide just enough light to prevent complete madness, became my lifeline during the occasional rainstorm. I learned to position the water bucket just right, angling it to catch the drops that leaked through the rotting window frame. Rainwater tastes like hope when you're dying of thirst. I memorized every sound in the building above me, the creaking floorboards that announced footsteps, the rhythm of daily routines, the exact times when the hallways would be empty. I learned that the heating pipes ran through the wall behind my cot, and that if I pressed my ear against the metal, I could hear conversations from the rooms above. That's how I discovered I wasn't the only one suffering. "Please, I'll be good." I heard a young voice sobbing one night through the pipes. "I promise I'll be good. I just want to see my sister." The response was Miss Garrett's voice, sickeningly sweet. "Good children don't make demands, Timothy. Good children are grateful for what they have." I pressed my face against the cold pipe and whispered, "You're not alone." I don't know if he heard me, but somehow it made us both feel less abandoned. The most important discovery came during my 4th week, when desperation drove me to search every inch of my concrete prison. Behind the cot, where the wall met the floor, I found a loose stone. When I worked it free, I discovered a small cavity that previous occupants had carved out, a hiding place that had been passed down through generations of broken children. Inside, I found treasures that would have meant nothing to the outside world, but everything to someone. In my situation, a stubby pencil, 3 pages torn from a notebook, and a small piece of mirror. But most importantly, I found words scratched into the stone itself, names, dates, and brief messages from children who had survived this room before me. Sarah M. 1959, "They can't keep us forever." Michael K. 1961, "Remember who you were before." Anna L. 1962, "Don't let them win." I wasn't the first child to be slowly starved in this room. I was part of a legacy of suffering that stretched back years, maybe decades. But I was also part of a legacy of survival. Using the pencil, I began to write. Not just my name and the date, but everything I could remember about Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Garrett, about the systems of cruelty I'd observed, about the other children who were suffering. I wrote about the golden children and the marked ones, about the calculated use of hunger as punishment, about the letters that never reached their intended recipients. If I died in this room, at least someone might find this record someday. At least the truth would survive, even if I didn't. But it was Rosa who saved me from becoming another ghost in the walls. First saw her through the crack under my door, thick-soled shoes moving differently than the sharp clicks of Mrs. Whitmore's heels or the hurried scurrying of Miss Garrett. These steps were softer, more careful, and they paused outside my door longer than they should have. On a Tuesday night, I think it was Tuesday, though the days had started to blur together, I heard a gentle scratching at my door. Then a voice, barely a whisper. "Mia, are you awake?" I crawled to the door, my legs shaking from weakness. "Who's there?" "My name is Rosa. I work in the kitchen." There was a pause. "I know what they're doing to you." Rosa, I learned, had been watching. She'd seen children disappear into the basement before, had watched them emerge weeks later as hollow-eyed shells of their former selves. She'd kept quiet because she needed the job, because she had her own children to feed, because speaking up would mean losing the only income her family had. But something about me, maybe my age, maybe the fact that I'd been down there longer than most, had finally pushed her past the point of silent complicity. "I'm going to help you," she whispered. "But you have to promise me something. Anything. You have to survive this. Do you understand? Whatever it takes, you have to survive." That night, she slipped a piece of bread under my door. It was small, torn from her own lunch, but it was the first food I'd received that wasn't measured and controlled by Mrs. Whitmore. It tasted like rebellion. Rosa came back the next night, and the next. Sometimes it was bread, sometimes a piece of fruit, once a small chunk of cheese that made my stomach cramp with unused joy. She told me about the outside world, about her own children, about the life that existed beyond these walls. But more than food, she gave me something infinitely more valuable. She bore witness to my suffering. She saw me as a human being when Everyone else saw me as a problem to be solved through starvation. Write it down, she told me one night when I described the daily routine of cruelty above. Write down everything you see, everything they do. Someday, someone will want to know the truth. So I wrote. By the flickering light of matches Rosa smuggled to me, I documented everything. Names, dates, methods of punishment, the systematic ways children were broken down and rebuilt. I wrote about the financial records I'd glimpsed, about the discrepancies between what the state provided and what the children received. I was creating evidence, though I didn't know it yet. I was building a case that would wait decades for its day in court. As the weeks dragged on, I felt my body changing in ways that scared me. My ribs became visible, my clothes hung loose, and climbing onto the cot became a challenge. But my mind was growing sharper, more focused. I was learning to see patterns, to understand systems, to think strategically about power and how it could be wielded. They thought they were teaching me submission. Instead, they were teaching me exactly how institutional cruelty worked. Knowledge I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Knowledge that would eventually become the foundation of my revenge. When I finally emerged from that basement room, I would be different, harder, more dangerous, but I would also be unbreakable. It happened on a Thursday morning in March, 4 months after they'd locked me in that basement room. I remember it was Thursday because I could hear the delivery trucks outside, bringing supplies that I knew would never make it to the children who needed them most. Was trying to stand up from my cot when the world tilted sideways. One moment, I was upright. The next I was on the cold concrete floor, my vision swimming with black spots that reminded me of the shadows that had started living at the edges of my sight. My body had been giving me warnings for weeks. The way my hands shook when I tried to write in my hidden journal. The way my heart raced when I stood too quickly. The way my thoughts would sometimes drift away mid-sentence, as if my brain was conserving energy for more essential functions. I'd ignored the warnings because acknowledging them meant admitting that Mrs. Whitmore was winning, that her carefully calculated cruelty was working exactly as intended. I tried to get up, pressing my palms against the floor, but my arms wouldn't support my weight. My legs felt like water, and there was a strange ringing in my ears that made it hard to think clearly. I remember wondering if this was how it would end, not with dramatic defiance, but with a quiet collapse in a basement room where no one would find me for hours. The morning routine continued above me. I could hear the children gathering for breakfast, their subdued voices carrying through the heating pipes. I thought about them sitting at those long tables, back straight, waiting for permission to eat food that should have been theirs by right. I thought about the ones who would get smaller portions today, the ones who would be marked for some imagined transgression. I thought about dying without ever seeing justice for any of them. That's when I heard the footsteps, not the familiar patterns I'd memorized, but something different, heavier, more urgent. And then voices raised in what sounded like an argument. "I need to see every child in this facility," a man's voice said, firm and professional. "That's not a request." "Of course," Mrs. Whitmore replied, but I could hear the strain in her voice. "Though I should mention that one of our children is currently in medical isolation. Nothing serious, just precautionary. I'll see that child first." My heart began to race, though whether from hope or fear I couldn't tell. Someone was coming. Someone who wasn't part of the machine that had been grinding me down for months. The footsteps approached my door, and I heard the sound of keys jangling. Light flooded the room as the door opened, and I squinted against the brightness, trying to make out the figure silhouetted in the doorway. "Dear God," the man whispered. Dr. Morrison, I learned later, was making his quarterly inspection of the facility. He'd been doing these visits for years, usually satisfied with Mrs. Whitmore's carefully orchestrated tours that showed him only what she wanted him to see. But something had changed, maybe a complaint from a former employee. Maybe a suspicion that had been growing in his mind. He'd insisted on seeing every child, including the ones who were supposed to be invisible. He knelt beside me on the concrete floor, his hands gentle as he checked my pulse, lifted my eyelids, felt for the bones that had become too prominent beneath my skin. His face was kind but deeply lined, with the look of someone who'd seen too much suffering in his profession. "What's your name, child?" "Margaret," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Margaret, I'm Dr. Morrison. I'm here to help you." He turned toward the door, where Mrs. Whitmore stood with Miss Garrett, both of them wearing expressions of carefully constructed concern. "Long has she been like this?" "She's been having some adjustment difficulties," Mrs. Whitmore said smoothly. "We've been providing her with medical supervision." Medical supervision? Dr. Morrison's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. "This child is severely malnourished. She's dehydrated, hypothermic, and showing signs of extended starvation." "How long has she been in this room?" "I really don't think. How long?" He stood up, and I could see the anger radiating from him like heat. "And don't lie to me." "I can. Tell from her condition that this has been going on for months." Mrs. Whitmore's mask slipped slightly. "Margaret has been receiving appropriate care according to her behavioral needs." "Behavioral needs?" Dr. Morrison's voice rose. "You've been starving a child as punishment?" "She's been receiving adequate nutrition. Look at her." He gestured toward me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in months' outrage on my behalf. "This child weighs maybe 70 pounds. She's been systematically starved. This is torture, not discipline." I tried to sit up, desperate to tell him about the others, about the system of cruelty that extended far beyond my basement room. But my body wouldn't cooperate, and the words came out as barely intelligible whispers. Dr. Morrison knelt beside me again. "What are you trying to say, Margaret?" "Others," I managed. "There are others." His face darkened further. "Other children being punished like this?" I nodded, and he stood up with such force that Miss Garrett actually stepped backward. "I want every medical record for every child in this facility," he said, his voice deadly. "Quiet. I want to see your meal plans, your discipline records, your correspondence files. Everything." "I don't think you have the authority." "I have the authority to report suspected child abuse to the state authorities," he interrupted. "And I have the authority to remove any child from this facility who is in immediate medical danger. Which, as far as I can tell, includes every child under your care." Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked completely. "You can't just watch me." He turned back to me, his voice gentling. "Margaret, I'm going to get you to a hospital. And I'm going to make sure this never happens to you or anyone else again." As he lifted me from the floor, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months' hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope I'd clung to in the darkness, but something stronger. The hope that comes from being seen, from being believed, from knowing that someone with power was finally on your side. But even as relief flooded through me, I knew this was just the beginning. Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Garrett would have explanations, justifications, ways to minimize what had happened. They'd been perfecting their system for years, and they wouldn't give up easily. As Dr. Morrison carried me toward the door, I caught sight of Mrs. Whitmore's face. The mask was completely gone, now replaced by something cold and calculating. She was already planning her next move, already figuring out how to protect herself and her institution. She thought she was dealing with a wounded child who would eventually be forgotten, another victim who would disappear into the system and never be heard from again. She had no idea that she was looking at her future destroyer. Dr. Morrison returned the next day with 2 nurses and a clipboard thick with notes. I was in a hospital gown by then, and 4 drip in my arm and warm broth in my stomach, my first real nourishment in 4 months. The brightness of the room hurt my eyes. The sheets smelled like bleach and safety. But I was afraid to close my eyes. Stood at the foot of my bed, frowning at the clipboard. You've gained 2 pounds overnight. That shouldn't be possible. What were they feeding you? I looked at him, searching for signs of duplicity, for the subtle cues I'd learned to read on adult faces. But all I saw was concern and weariness, the kind that suggested he'd spent years convincing himself he wasn't complicit just because he didn't look too closely. They weren't, I whispered. He closed the chart slowly and sat beside me. Margaret, he said, his voice gentler, I need you to tell me everything. I hesitated. The room was warm, but I still pulled the blanket tighter around me. If I talk, they'll hurt the others. Not if we act fast, he said. Not if we do this right. I told him about the learning portions, about the reflection room, about Tommy Morrison's hollow cheeks and Sarah Henderson's tight, rehearsed smile. I told him about the confiscated letters and the children who vanished for days and returned mute-eyed and gaunt. I wrote it all down, I said. His brows rose. Where? I told him about the journal, the loose stone behind the cot, the matches. Rosa had smuggled in. His mouth tightened at the mention of Rosa. I want to speak with her, he said. Double quotes. No, not yet. They'll fire her if they know. He considered this, then nodded slowly. Can you describe the hiding place? I drew it for him on the back of a napkin. Every crevice of that room burned into my memory. He folded it carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. Before he left, he turned at the door. Margaret, I owe you an apology. I blinked, startled. For what? For not seeing. For visiting that place for 5 years and never asking the right questions. He looked at me with something close to reverence. You've done what most adults never find the courage to do. I looked down. At my hands bony, trembling, scarred from scrubbing floors and nights spent curled against stone. I didn't do it for courage, I said. I did it to survive. He nodded. Sometimes that's the same thing. They didn't let me go back to St. Catherine's. I remember the way the nurse said it softly, like it was a kindness. Dr. Morrison has reported everything. You're safe now. There's no reason to return. That something inside me screamed. Safe. I didn't want safety. I wanted answers. I wanted the others to know I hadn't abandoned them. I wanted to look Rosa in the eyes and say, I made it. I'm going to make sure you do too. Instead, I was discharged to a temporary group home in the city, cleaner, kinder, and no reflection. Rooms in sight. But I still jumped every time I heard keys jingle. Still ate too fast, still hid scraps under my pillow. Still dreamt of wet concrete and the flicker of Rosa's matchlight. I was 16 when I finally aged out. They gave me a duffel bag, a bus pass, and a handshake. No one asked what I'd survived. No one asked about the journal or the names I'd memorized. But I remembered. 2 days before I left, a letter arrived. It was forwarded through a maze of social workers and bureaucratic desks. But it found me. Dearest Margaret, I don't know if you're still there, or if you'll ever read this, but I'm writing again because I won't stop hoping. It was from Uncle Chen. He had written every month since the fire. Sent letters, money, even a lawyer once, but they were always turned away. It wasn't until Dr. Morrison's report hit the state board that the truth came to light. The letters had been intercepted, the paperwork buried. I never gave up looking for you. I'm so sorry it took this long. I held the letter to my chest, and for the first time since the fire, I cried like a child. Not out of fear, but because I wasn't forgotten. I met Rosa one last time before I left. I wasn't supposed to. I'd snuck onto a bus, wearing a hoodie that swallowed my frame, clutching a paper bag with half my possessions. She was waiting, behind the grocery store near St. Catherine's, where the delivery truck still unloaded boxes every Thursday morning. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Dios mío, she whispered, rushing to hug me. You're too thin. I'm leaving, I said. They're sending me out. She touched my cheek. That's good. That means you made it. I needed to see you before I go. She opened the paper bag I handed her. Inside was the notebook, the journal from the war. I'd recopied. Every page, added more, indexed names, mapped the building, even included the date I first heard Timothy cry through the pipe. Someday, this is going to matter, I said. She held it like a sacred thing. It already does. Then, from her apron pocket, she pulled something out. A folded photograph. My photograph. My parents, laughing in front of the restaurant. Mama's arm on Barbara's shoulder. Slightly faded, but whole. I kept it safe, Rosa said. They threw everything else away, but not this. I wanted to fall to my knees. Instead, I pressed it to my lips. My mother's face. My father's smile. The promise of a life they'd never get to finish, but I could. I boarded the Greyhound bus alone. No luggage. Just the photo in my coat, and a copy of the journal in my lap. As the city blurred past the windows, I stared straight ahead. I made a vow that day, one I would repeat every morning for the next 50 years. I will come back. I will not be small. I will have power. And when I do, I will shut them down. Every last one of them. People think vengeance is a fire, something loud and hot and immediate. But they're wrong. Vengeance, the kind that endures, is a stone, cold, heavy, carried quietly for years until you've built the hands strong enough to lift it, and the world that deserves to feel its weight. At 17, I scrubbed dishes in the back of a Chinatown restaurant for $1.25 an hour. I lived in a studio apartment with 3 other girls from the group home and ate rice with soy sauce when tips were good and plain rice when they weren't. I worked 12-hour days and took night classes. I read business books from the library during lunch breaks and listened to customers negotiate prices with suppliers in English I barely understood. Never forgot what Mrs. Whitmore told me. You still think the world owes you something. She was right. It did. But it wasn't going to give it freely. So I learned how to take it without begging. I opened my first food cart at 24. Chun's dumplings. I borrowed money from a cousin of my uncle, lied on the permit application about my experience, and nearly gave up when the fryer exploded during my first week. But the customers kept coming. They liked my food. They liked my smile. No one saw the notebook I kept under the cash register, filled with names and dates and profits logged to the penny. By 29, I had 3 carts and a lease on a storefront. By 35, I opened 2 more restaurants. I hired women like Rosa mothers, immigrants, caretakers who had been overlooked and underpaid, and I gave them full benefits and a seat at the planning table. I didn't do it out of charity. I did it because they saw everything, like Rosa did. They missed nothing. When a supplier tried to shortchange me because I was a woman, I smiled like Mrs. Whitmore used to and said, "Try that again, and I'll own your truck by next month." They never tried again. By my 40s, I'd expanded into manufacturing pre-made sauces, frozen dumplings, commercial kitchen rentals. I hired lawyers, accountants, and former regulators. I learned zoning laws, food safety loopholes, and the art of turning an inspection into free press. I never married, never had children. I told people I was too busy, too driven. The truth was simpler. I'd already spent my childhood raising myself. I didn't want another innocent person tangled in my unfinished war. But I watched. Always. I watched St. Catherine's. Name changed. The facade changed. A new logo appeared, softer colors. A smiling child. A website full of stock images and platitudes. But the bones of the building were the same. And every few years, another whisper surfaced. A girl in foster care with bruises and nightmares. A boy who ran away and refused to explain why. A staff member dismissed quietly, with a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. I started documenting. Kept files, real ones this time. I hired a private investigator in the area to do yearly drop-ins disguised as plumbing checks and maintenance estimates. I tracked every employee name I could find. Some disappeared after a year. Others had been there far too long. And then, in my 60s, I found the smoking gun. Her name was Mrs. Patricia Garrett. She was now the director. It was an email in a leaked HR file someone from the state's child welfare office had flagged her during a background check, but no action was taken. No investigation. The email was buried under bureaucratic dust. That night, I opened the last drawer in my desk and pulled out the notebook I'd carried with me through the decades. My handwriting had changed, but the names were still legible. Sarah Henderson, Tommy Morrison, Rosa Alvarez. And on the last page, she thinks she broke me. She just made me careful. I started the process 6 months later. Through a shell company in Delaware, I purchased the property and the adjoining land under the name Chen Development Partners. I paid in cash. The papers passed through 6 hands before they landed on Patricia Garrett's desk. She had no idea who was behind the transaction. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. First, I needed to build the strike. It wasn't enough to own the land. I wanted proof. I wanted the kind of evidence that couldn't be buried in a filing cabinet or explained away with polite lies. I wanted it documented, witnessed, exposed. So I began the investigation. Not with lawyers yet. Not with the police. I knew better than to trust institutions to hold each other accountable. Instead, I hired a team of retired auditors, child advocates, and 2 former investigative journalists. People with nothing left to prove but everything to make right. I gave them one instruction: find out if what happened to me is still happening. And if it is, don't stop until we can burn it to the ground. The files they returned within the first 6 months nearly made me vomit. Testimonies, photos, financial ledgers. There was a boy named Isaiah who'd been placed there after his parents died in a car accident. At age 9, he weighed 48 pounds. A nurse's aide reported his bruises, but her report was marked as inconclusive. She was let go 2 weeks later for attendance issues. A girl named Lena had tried to run away. When found, she claimed she was being locked in a closet for days at a time for stealing food. Her file said she was emotionally disturbed and prone to fabrication. A cook wrote an anonymous letter stating that food deliveries regularly came in full, but storage was often half-stocked the next day. They say it's inventory shrink. I think it's someone's second income. Then came the name I'd been waiting for: Patricia Garrett. She'd been promoted to director in 2006. Since then, 5 staff complaints had been filed, none investigated. 3 children under her care were hospitalized with severe malnutrition between 2010 and 2015. All incidents were ruled medically complex or due to emotional trauma. The system hadn't just failed again. It had survived. It had adapted. She was still running it. I flew in under another name. Walked past the resting gate in jeans and a plain cardigan. One of my investigators posed as a visiting volunteer, holding a clipboard and a carefully crafted badge. I didn't need to step inside to know the weeds had returned. The same crack in the path. The sharp smell of bleach meant to mask something. else. But then I saw it pressed to the window of a second-story dormitory room. A child's face. Thin, pale, watching me with the same wide eyes I remembered wearing 60 years ago. Something in me clenched. No more waiting. That night, I finalized everything. I contacted Child Protective Services and scheduled an anonymous tip, the kind that triggers an unannounced welfare inspection. Then I called in my legal team and had them notify the police, media, and state licensing board. All were invited to an emergency stakeholder meeting at the facility scheduled for the following week. Finally, I booked a private flight and called James, my driver. "Cancel the rest of the month," I said. "We're going to St. Catherine's." Before I hung up, I pulled out a thin folder I'd kept locked away for decades. Inside was Rosa's last letter to me. She had passed away 5 years ago. I had buried her myself in a quiet cemetery near her grandchildren's home in Queens. But before she died, she sent me a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "When you go back, don't just tear it down. Build something better. Make it what we always dreamed it could be. I'll be watching." That night, I sat at my desk and wrote one final line in my old journal. "Tomorrow, I go home." The Bentley rolled to a stop outside the gates of St. Catherine's at 8:45 a.m. By 9 o'clock, the press vans arrived. Local outlets, a few national names, all tipped off anonymously. Unmarked police cruisers followed. Then a black car bearing the emblem of the State Child Welfare Office. Behind them came 2 social workers, a family court liaison, and a licensed trauma counselor. They all expected a scandal. None of them knew they were about to witness an execution. I stepped out of the car last, dressed not in our money, but in a soft charcoal coat and low heels. No jewelry, no makeup. Just the same steel I'd carried with me since I was 12 years old and starving behind those iron bars. James opened the door and handed me my briefcase. Inside were copies of deeds, transfer agreements, and a letter of ownership signed and notarized. Margaret L. Chen, sole proprietor of 112 Hawthorne Lane, formerly St. Catherine's Home for Children. Miss Garrett stood on the front steps, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 confused junior staff members. Her hair was thinner now, dyed too dark for her age. Her mouth was pinched, the same mouth that once told me, "Good children don't make demands." She looked at the gathering crowd and tried to assert control. "We weren't expecting visitors today," she said, forcing a smile. "Please contact our main office to schedule." A state inspector stepped forward. "You were notified. We're here for a compliance audit." "I wasn't told." "No," I said, stepping forward, "because the notification didn't go to you. It went to the property owner." "That would be me." Miss Garrett blinked. "Excuse me?" I opened the briefcase and handed her the papers. "Effective last Friday, this property is under new ownership. Your employment has been terminated. Please hand over your keys." The color drained from her face. She didn't even recognize me yet. The doors were opened and the inspection began. I followed behind, silent but present, as every drawer, closet, and food pantry was photographed and logged. The state officials asked questions, took statements, examined the logs. The trauma counselor took aside 3 children for private interviews. One came back sobbing. Another refused to speak. Meanwhile, I called a locksmith to change every lock in the building. Miss Garrett trailed me like a ghost. "This is illegal," she hissed. "You have no right to disrupt operations like this." "No." "Right?" I turned slowly. "And yet, you exercise the right to starve children in the name of discipline." Her mouth opened, closed. "That was decades ago." I leaned in, voice low. "I remember the way your shoes clicked down the hallway. I remember the sound of your voice outside my door. You don't remember me? She blinked. Her eyes narrowed. Margaret, she said slowly. Margaret Chun. Now you remember. She stepped back as if slapped. You're the one. I'm the one you locked in a basement for 4 months while you ate off government food budgets and burned my uncle's letters. I turned to the state officials. I have sworn affidavits, medical records, and testimony detailing systemic abuse. And that journal, I nodded toward the briefcase, has everything I documented while I was being starved under this roof. Miss Garrett was escorted off the premises just after noon. She didn't protest after that. The cameras caught. Her retreat shoulders slumped. Coat crooked, makeup streaking under the October sun. The news crews were salivating. But I wasn't finished. I called a staff meeting for the remaining employees. Some were new, young, and clearly shaken. Others had been there too long. I know some of you came here to do good, I began, facing them in the main hall, the same place where I once sat cross-legged on the floor, too weak to lift my spoon. I know others looked away when you should have spoken. I took out a stack of envelopes. These are severance packages, generous ones, but effective immediately. Your services are no longer required. Someone asked, what will happen to the children? I'm not closing the facility, I said. I'm rebuilding it. From the ground up. By evening, the halls were empty. Of staff, but not of children. I walked to the second floor and stood outside the dormitory I'd once called home. A small boy peeked out from behind a curtain. I raised a hand. He didn't wave back, but he didn't look away either. Downstairs, James waited patiently with the engine running. Stood a moment longer at the top of the stairs. I was home, but now I was the one holding the keys. Found her sitting alone in the staff break room. The blinds were half drawn. The walls yellowed with time and a brittle silence hung in the air. She'd refused to leave with the others, insisted on one final word, as if she was still entitled to something. As if 60 years of harm could be packaged into a last-minute justification. Patricia Garrett looked smaller now. The shoulders that once loomed over my 12-year-old self were hunched. Her hands shook slightly as she stirred sugar into cold coffee. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. You don't have to be here, I said. Calmly. She didn't look up. You could have just sold the place. Or shut it down quietly. But you wanted a show. I pulled out the chair across from her. I wanted accountability. She gave a tight, humorless laugh. And this is what? Justice? After all these years? I set the leather-bound journal on the table between us and opened to the page where her name appeared dozens of times. Each instance a mark, a memory. A wound turned into documentation. She stared at it but didn't touch it. You used to. Say good children don't make demands, I said. What were you afraid of? That we'd ask for too much? Or that we'd start to believe we were worth it? Her lips pressed into a hard line. You don't understand what it was like. We had too many kids. Not enough staff. No funding. Every week, I had to make decisions I hated. You didn't just enforce the rules, I replied, voice tightening. You enjoyed them. You smiled when we cried. You told us pain was discipline. She shook her head. That wasn't me. That was Whitmore. I was just trying to survive her. I leaned forward, my voice razor sharp. No, Rosa survived her. You imitated her. Her eyes flashed at that. You don't know everything. You think you do because you built a business and bought some land, but you don't know what it was like to be trapped here and powerless. I stared at her. Yes, I do. We sat in silence then, the weight of everything unsaid filling the room like fog. She looked old, not just in years, but in the sagging of her mouth, the way her blouse hung from her frame, the absence of certainty in her eyes. And for the first time, I felt no fear. No hate, just a deep, irreversible distance. "I didn't come here to destroy you, Miss Garrett," I said quietly. "I came to end something you helped build. And what do you want from me now? An apology?" "No," I said. "That would mean too little, too late." I slid the journal toward her. "I want you to read it. Every name, every line, every act of cruelty you participated in or enabled. You don't owe me an apology. You owe them one." She looked at the journal like it burned her fingers. I stood. "When you're done, leave the key on the table. Your security clearance has already been revoked." She didn't respond, just kept staring at the open-page dot as I reached the door. She finally spoke. Her voice was thin, but brittle with something like desperation. "Did I ruin your life?" I paused in the doorway. "No," I said without turning around. "You shaped it, but you don't own the ending." The next morning, the journal was gone, dot in its place. A single sheet of paper. Handwritten, dot, not a confession. Not quite, just a list of names. A few I recognized. Most I didn't. Staff who had come and gone. Children who had been marked. Incidents she remembered. The years she finally admitted, dot, it wasn't closure. But it was a start. And for the first time, I believed she might carry those names with her until the end of her life, dot, as she should. That afternoon, I held a private meeting with the children still living in the home. They sat cross-legged in the same room where I once endured lectures about gratitude and silence. But now the chairs had been removed. The windows were open, and I knelt down to their eye level. "I was one of you," I told them. "This place hurt me, but now it belongs to someone who sees you." There were no gasps, no applause, just the quiet alertness of children who had learned to survive by listening more than speaking. One little girl raised her hand. "Will we still have bedtime snacks?" she asked. I smiled. "You'll have dinner, snacks, blankets, therapy, and people who know your name. Every day." She nodded solemnly. Then slowly she reached out and touched my arm, like she was making sure I was real. Outside, the crew began taking down the old sign, dot, in a week. A new one would go up, dot, the Rosa Alvarez Center for Children. The first floor was gutted by spring, dot. We tore out the old linoleum, peeled back the mildew-stained paint, and demolished the rusted kitchen appliances that had once produced meals of measured starvation. In their place, sunlight, polished floors, a modern industrial kitchen with full shelves and a menu, designed by a pediatric nutritionist. The basement was filled in entirely. I wouldn't allow a single child to sleep above the room where I had been erased. We sealed it, sanctified it, and built a library over it filled with picture books, journals, soft chairs, and soundproof nooks. A place where stories could be read, written, and never taken away. The old reflection room had become the seed of something better. I named the building the Rosa Alvarez Center for Children and made sure the plaque at the front door included the words, "Because one witness can save a life." Her granddaughter came to the dedication ceremony. She wore a sunflower pin and brought a photo of Rosa smiling in a garden apron. When she handed it to me, she whispered, "She always said you were the bravest person she knew." I shook my head. She was wrong. It was her. Staff were hired carefully trained therapists, multilingual educators, counselors with trauma-informed certifications. Every room had cameras monitored not by security, but by a third-party wellness review team. Every child had a case manager. Every week included one-on-one check-ins. And not a single staff member could touch state funds without oversight. Some said I was overbuilding, overthinking. But I remember too clearly what happens when no one thinks hard enough. I began therapy. Myself that summer. Not because I believed in it, at first, but because one of the girls, Eliza, aged 10, asked me gently one day, "Do you talk to someone too?" I told her the truth. "Not yet." She tilted her head. "You should. You seem like you hold a lot." I laughed. Then I cried. And then I booked the appointment. Healing wasn't a straight line. There were days I still woke at 4 a.m. with the sensation of being locked in a room with no air. But I began to walk more slowly, to breathe in the scent of real bread baking in the new kitchen, to stand in the garden where weeds had once claimed the yard, now replaced with climbing roses and herbs. I spent more time listening than speaking. The children came to know me, not as the CEO, but as Mrs. Chun, who brings dumplings on Thursdays and reads the funny voices in bedtime stories. One morning, a letter arrived at my office. The return address: Detroit. It was postmarked in shaky cursive, addressed to Margaret L. Chen. Inside, a card, plain, blue, handwritten in 2 languages. Dear niece, I have lived many years thinking I failed you. Now, I see you never needed saving. You became the kind of woman your parents prayed for. I am proud of you beyond words. Come visit. The rice is waiting. Tears rolled down my cheeks. Not from grief, but from arrival. At 73, I stood once again at the gates of what used to be my prison. They were open now, newly painted, trimmed with vines and missing the spear-like tips. Children's laughter echoed across the grounds. Boy chased a girl with a squirt gun. A counselor walked beside them with popsicles. A teacher sat cross-legged in the grass reading aloud from a book that used to sit in my journal cave under the cot. Took a breath. The iron had left my bones, but the fire remained, no longer rage, but purpose. I had once been a forgotten child. Now, I was a remembered woman. And I had built something they could never take from me. Something that would outlive every lock, every lie, and every scar. A sanctuary, born from hunger, forged by memory, and guarded always by love.